Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this first teaching and learning seminar for 2024-2025. And it's my pleasure to welcome this evening for us, this morning, for Dr. Jones, our speaker, Dr. Emma Jones. Dr. Jones is a senior lecturer in law at the University of Sheffield. She's the chair of the Association of Law Teachers in the UK, and she's the general editor of the Law Teacher, which is kind of the scholarly journal linked with the Association of Law Teachers. Dr. Jones's research focus is on the role of well-being in legal education and the legal profession. She's a member of the IBA Wellbeing Commission, leading on the IBA International Guidelines for Wellbeing in Legal Education. And Dr. Jones leads on the development of the Fit for Law initiative with the UK charity Lawcare. Not formally, but not anymore, Dr. Jones was the Director of Student Wellbeing for the School of Law at the University of Sheffield, but he moved on from that role, but may speak about it. So without more ado, Dr. Jones, let me welcome you. I should let me one last bit of housekeeping. If you've got any questions, could you put them in the chat, please, to me, Michael Lower, and then I would read them out to Dr. Jones. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Jones.
Thank you, Michael, and hello, everybody. It is brilliant to be here with you today. So I quite ambitiously titled my presentation, How Do We Thrive in Law Schools? And if I could fully answer that within an hour, then if I'm honest, I don't think I'd be speaking to you today. I think I'd be on a luxury yacht somewhere, because I would have sold it to every law school and made millions of pounds. So realistically, I don't think I can give you a full answer today. However, what I do want to do is pull together a lot of the evidence that is out there, and that's from my research and from the research of many others in the field, to talk about the kind of guidelines that we can follow for ourselves, for students, and for the law school community as a whole. So in the title, I mentioned the term thrive. And so the first question we really need to think about is, what do we mean when we think about thriving? And I wondered what thriving meant to you all here today. So when I was thinking about this, I thought about things like my family making me feel happy and secure. I thought about the fact I've got 3 cats and a dog, and they give me a great deal of pleasure and relaxation. And I thought about the hobbies that I do, and all those things, I think, together help me to thrive for a majority of the time. But I was interested to hear from you. What does thriving mean to you? So if you have any ideas you'd like to share on that, please feel free to put them in the chat box so I can see them. While you're thinking about that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the evidence around notions of things like thriving. Really, when we're thinking about thriving, we're thinking about well-being, what's sometimes termed individual subjective well-being. And there are 2 different, broadly speaking, traditions around the idea of what well-being and thriving are. And the first of those is hedonic. So this effectively equates well-being, equates thriving to happiness. The second of these is eudaimonic. So this is really based on the principles set out by Aristotle, and it acknowledges the role of happiness, but it sees well-being as being broader. It sees it as being about having a purpose, having a meaning in your life, being able to contribute meaningfully to society, through your work, through your family. It's a bit like my example of pets. I have my 3 cats and a dog. They do not always make me happy, particularly not when they're bringing mice into the house, for example. But at the same time, looking after them, caring for them, actually gives me a sense of meaning and a sense of purpose. So I think there is strong evidence that the eudaimonic tradition of well-being is an important one. And it's one that's actually supported if you look at many key definitions of well-being, for example, the World Health Organization's discussions around good mental health and well-being. The eudaimonic tradition has largely been developed recently through the field of positive psychology. This came into being to challenge the idea that psychology should all be around rectifying deficits in well-being, that it should be all about tackling mental ill health. It actually sees psychology as an important tool, not just to tackle issues and deficits, but actually to promote positive well-being, to promote thriving, or as one of the founders, Martin Seligman, talks about, flourishing. And one of the key examples of this that you may well have come across, because it's used a significant amount in the literature on law schools and law students, is the idea of self-determination theory. And this talks about the conditions that people need to thrive, to have good well-being. And it talks about things like motivation and intrinsic motivation and the importance of that in driving people. But it also talks about the idea of basic psychological needs. And it talks about the idea that to thrive, people need autonomy. So they need some freedom of choice, ability to make their own decisions. They need competence. They need the sense that they can effectively do something, that they can carry out tasks appropriately, and they need relatedness. They need that sense of social connection, be it with family, friends, work colleagues, and so on. And this is quite often used as a model for looking at law schools and the legal profession to see whether those elements are present and how they feed into levels of well-being and thriving in those arenas. So I just want to pause here because I mentioned I was talking about individual subjective well-being. However, I did want to make the point that it is not just about an individual, and indeed that's acknowledged in positive psychology. It's acknowledged in lots of other traditions and work on well-being and thriving, because how we feel, how our life course develops, is often affected by a range of other external factors. That could be to do with our workplace. It could be to do with our personal situation, our family, our friends. It could be to do with myriad other socio-economic factors. So that is one reason why I always have concerns about the idea of resilience and talking about resilience in relation to thriving, because often what that means is, as an individual, you're expected to become stronger, to become more superhero-like, to be able to withstand anything that is thrown at you. But there are always limits to resilience, and that is really individualizing a problem that has lots of societal, cultural, and structural issues. So it's important to acknowledge that it's not just about empowering individuals, it's about looking at the root causes that may be generating poor well-being, that may be preventing people from thriving. And I'll talk about this a little bit more when we come on to look at what some of those conditions might be specifically within law schools. I thought it might be helpful to give you a little bit of a snapshot of why thriving might be particularly pertinent to law schools. And the basis for this is that there is evidence of poor staff and student well-beings throughout higher education in a number of jurisdictions. So if we take the UK as an example, there's clear evidence from organisations such as Student Minds that actually the well-being of university students falls below that of the general population. Of course, we've recently had COVID-19, and that exacerbated these problems even further, but they did still exist, at least to some extent, beforehand. When we look at law students, specifically compared to students of other disciplines, there is some evidence, particularly from the US and Australia, that actually law students have the lowest levels of well-being within higher education compared to, say, psychology or even medical students. Now, some of that is contested, but what does seem to be clear is that there are specific aspects of the discipline of law that can exacerbate well-being issues. So you may have heard of the phrase thinking like a lawyer, which is a term that's often used to suggest that as a law student, as a legal academic, you have to be rigorously analytical. You can't acknowledge emotions. You can't kind of think outside these exceedingly rigid patterns. We also probably all are aware of the competitiveness that can be involved within law degrees, particularly if students are battling for a limited number of roles within the legal profession. In common law jurisdictions, we are aware of the adversarialism that is sometimes inbred even within law degrees. And of course, there's significant evidence that all these problems extend into the legal profession. As Michael mentioned, I'm involved with the International Bar Association. In 2021, they undertook a global survey of lawyer well-being, and the findings pointed to what they termed a global crisis in lawyer well-being. It was clear that lawyer well-being fell below that of the general population, and those elements of things like competitiveness, adversarialism, many others all factored into that. So it's really crucial for us as law schools, not just for our own community, but when we think about how we want the legal profession to be, that we really think about well-being and thriving. You may have heard the term healthy justice requires healthy lawyers, and I think that's an important one to bear in mind here. So you may be thinking, well, this is all very well, but I teach, for example, contract law, I teach law of criminal law. I'm not really involved in things to do with well-being and thriving. And I tried to pull together some of those kind of comments that I've heard in the past from people working within law schools. And the common refrain, I think, is well-being is a purely pastoral issue. The idea that, yeah, we are academics, we are staff within law schools, it's not our business. There is wider support out there, perhaps in the university, perhaps outside the university, for students and staff to access if they need it. I don't know if you've read Stanley Fish's book, Save the World in Your Own Time, but he pretty much makes that kind of argument, particularly in relation to values, and it's a very well-written book. Unfortunately, I think the evidence shows that well-being cannot be viewed as a purely pastoral issue, whether we want to or not. We need to think about the well-being of ourselves, our colleagues, and our students, and our overall community. There is significant evidence out there from fields such as neuroscience, which demonstrates that well-being interacts with learning, for example. So what your level of well-being is will impact upon how you learn, what you learn, how well you learn. Similarly, what you're learning will be impacting upon your well-being. So there is that bi-directional relationship there. We can't simply silo well-being as a pastoral issue because it affects all different aspects of the law school experience. That comes on to the next thing that's sometimes said to me is, I'm a legal academic. I'm not trained as a therapist. I don't have the background. I don't have the understanding. And of course, it's important we understand our limitations and our boundaries. However, the evidence, certainly from the UK, and I suspect in many other jurisdictions, indicates that whether they want to or not, people throughout universities are having to be involved as well-being. If we are in a law school and we are engaging with students, then we are likely to be their first point of contact if they do have any kind of well-being issue, because we are building up those relationships and connections with students, which we need to facilitate their learning. But it means then that they have that level of trust to talk to us and share these issues. So then we have a responsibility, whether that is signposting the student to other support, whether it is simply listening in some situations, we have that responsibility. So I would suggest, just as we understand our responsibility to upskill ourselves in relation to things such as pedagogy, we actually have some obligation to upskill ourselves in relation to well-being. And there are many resources out there. We do not have to reinvent the wheel, and I'll come on to talk about one of those resources in a little while. And of course, it's not just about student well-being, but in terms of us as staff, it's important that we have that literacy in relation to well-being to help ourselves, help our colleagues as well. This goes on to another point that is sometimes here, that people saying, well, the problem is students now are effectively consumers. So our institution, our law school will prioritise their well-being and they don't necessarily care so much about staff well-being. And I suspect that may well be true in some situations, but I would argue that actually staff and student well-being is so closely interconnected that you need to have well staff to have well students. It's that idea of fitting your own oxygen mask first, that kind of statement that's always given out at the start of aeroplane journeys. If we don't have healthy staff, if we're not healthy, how can we support our students? And this can be quite a complex balancing act because our interests may differ. But I certainly think in terms of well-being, actually our interests are complementary. So, for example, if a member of staff takes some time, which may well be difficult, to upskill themselves by, say, attending a training session on supporting students, listening to students, then actually if they can put that into practice, then although they've had to take that time, they can proactively deal with issues that arise before they hit crisis point and before you have to retroactively deal with them in a way that often takes more time because it has hit that real breaking point. The final objection I've sometimes heard, and if you've heard others, please feel free to put them in the chat box, is the idea that we don't want to open the floodgates. If we encourage students to think about well-being and emotions, we're going to be inundated with problems, with issues. We're going to have students crying in the classrooms. Again, I don't think the evidence supports this idea. Actually, if we're in an environment where everybody has the literacy to talk about and acknowledge well-being and emotions, it's a much healthier environment to be in. We are much less likely to hit that kind of crisis point where actually there are great extremes in terms of poor well-being and emotions. It's a much more healthy environment to be in. So I mentioned a little bit about guidance, that you don't have to reinvent the wheel when we're thinking about how we thrive in law schools, because there is a lot of research and work out there. And one of the projects I've been involved in for the last couple of years is working with the International Bar Association on international guidelines for wellbeing in legal education. And the aim of these, there are 10 guidelines, and the aim is to pull together the research on wellbeing in legal education into a set of guidelines that can be followed by law schools. And by law schools, we mean that broadly. It could be, for example, vocational training providers. It could be providers of continuing professional development, as well as university law schools. We do acknowledge there are likely to be significant jurisdictional differences, and even within a jurisdiction, there are likely to be differences between law schools that impact how they can engage with and operationalize these guidelines. It's never going to be a one size fits all, but the hope is that these guidelines enable law schools to have a clear set of aspirations to work towards and implement in a way that they can within their particular socioeconomic, political and cultural setting. They do have a community of early adopters. We have 13 law schools globally, and they are all starting from very, very different positions. Some in jurisdictions such as Turkey and United Arab Emirates tell me that wellbeing simply isn't ever discussed in relation to legal education. So for them, the first real step is simply to start having that discussion, to raise awareness that wellbeing may well be a relevant issue. Whereas we have others in jurisdictions such as Australia and New Zealand, where they have very high levels of literacy around wellbeing, and their focus is, for example, on how you can embed discussion on wellbeing and wellbeing considerations into the curriculum. But I did want to talk briefly through the guidelines today, because as I said, I think they do draw together the relevant evidence. They were developed with a wide range of contributors, and also based on myself and my co-authors' own research. For example, myself and Professor Caroline Strevens conducted a series of interviews with heads of law schools across the UK as part of this. So the first guideline focuses on this idea of simply acknowledging that wellbeing is relevant and important to law schools, that it isn't just a pastoral issue, it is crucial across all activities, and that there is that research that underpins this concept of wellbeing. So we are encouraging law schools to explicitly and proactively promote positive wellbeing, and that is among both staff and students. As I said before, you can't support the wellbeing of one group without looking at the wellbeing of another group. It may also include prospective and former students. So when we think about the messages our prospective students receive about law, I wonder what they think. There is some evidence, for example, in the UK, that many law schools still have images of students mooting, standing there in quasi-courts, wearing barrister-type robes, even wigs, holding papers, and it promotes a certain image of law, and it promotes a certain idea of the culture of law, perhaps the adversarialism of law, which can, before students even get to law school, start to instill in them certain views, which then feed into ideas of professional identity, competitiveness, and those factors which are identified as discipline specific and potentially damaging to wellbeing. So thinking even about messages before students reach us can be important. And similarly, I mentioned before the issues with wellbeing in the legal profession. We are sending our students out, certainly in some cases, into a challenging landscape. And how are we equipping them to move into that? Part of this will be about ameliorating negative impacts on the wellbeing of staff and students, and that can be some of those norms that I've already talked about. But we also wanted to be more positive. We do think that law school communities can and should thrive. So we want it to be a sustainable approach which is integrated into all aspects of legal education to achieve that. The second guideline is effectively looking at how law schools define well-being. And again, this moves back to this positive psychology movement and the idea that it should be about flourishing and thriving. As the academic Paula Barron puts it, it should be about thriving, not just surviving. And that's for all the individuals, but also the institutions, the communities, and the discipline of law as a whole. We don't try and impose a specific definition of well-being, although we do refer to the World Health Organization discussion about good mental health. But we do try and identify that positive psychology viewpoint and that eudaimonic tradition as being important. The third guideline is really trying to give an idea of the scope of addressing well-being. One way it can be done is, of course, simply having, say, a webinar about well-being, whether that's for staff and students. And of course, it is important to provide staff and students with appropriate advice on things like self-care, their approaches to study or teaching, other aspects of law school life. But of course, that alone isn't sufficient. It could be termed as something of a sticking plaster approach. It doesn't look at the broader issues. It tackles the symptoms, not the cause. So it's also important that law schools provide staff with appropriate time and training and support, and that students are also provided with those elements as well. And I think part of it is also simply about being honest about things like legal practice and the legal profession and the challenges that people can face in those environments, which will help students to be prepared to move into them. We also emphasise in the guidelines that it is important to think about well-being in terms of learning and teaching. And this could be, for some topics, actually including specific well-being related content. So, for example, I teach law of obligations, and in that topic, we can talk about emotions in terms of issues such as contractual duress. We can talk about well-being in terms of the approach to non-pecuniary losses in contract. And we can also talk about it in terms of the approach to personal injury claims and the way that they are compensated or not effectively compensated. But it can also be about putting in information about healthy study techniques. So when I was Director of Student Wellbeing, we had a whole set of slides that staff could pick and choose from that were about things like healthy study, dealing with extenuating circumstances, revising in healthy ways, making sure you take regular breaks, all those kind of things. It can also be about looking at things like how we assess students and how well they are prepared for those assessments and how that is scaffolded, and the type of feedback we can give, which is, and I think we probably all know this from feedback in different aspects of our life, receiving feedback, particularly negative feedback, can be incredibly difficult, and that can lead you to disengaged. So well-being should be a key consideration whenever we are providing feedback. It can be about skills, it can be about that well-being literacy, it can be about things such as emotional literacy, which are all skills that sometimes termed soft skills or people skills are really important if we think about the legal profession too. An important aspect is reflective practice, not just asking students to reflect cognitively, but asking them to reflect on their emotions, their feelings, their experience in terms of well-being. And of course, there are things that are very practical, the sort of administrative practices. How are sessions timetabled? You know, how long are sessions? You know, are there breaks built in? All those kind of things that can make significant differences. But of course, it isn't just as simple as making a sweeping change that might aim to promote good well-being. It's also about helping people to navigate that kind of change in a healthy way. If we are making changes, one of the things that is absolutely key is to put in place measures to assess and evaluate the changes, the actions that are being taken, because well-being is kind of a never-ending journey. Things are always changing. COVID, of course, is an excellent example of that, but there will be many, many more examples to come. So it can't be a one-shot approach. It's got to be an iterative process of continuing to develop. I mentioned the IBA Global Survey of Lawyer Wellbeing before, and one of the findings in that was that a number of firms were beginning to put in place wellbeing measures. For example, an employee assistance plan, or perhaps some kind of webinar on wellbeing. But what was also striking was very few firms actually evaluated how successful those initiatives were, or actually put in any significant resource into developing those initiatives. It can't be about a one-off approach. It has to be about a sustainable long-term approach. The sixth guideline in our international guidelines for wellbeing in legal education relates to policies and procedures. So this is effectively about making wellbeing an integral part of the normal business of the law school. So it's having perhaps a wellbeing policy or procedure. It could be called a student success policy or procedure. It could be called many different things, but one that is effectively focused on wellbeing. But it's also about factoring in wellbeing considerations when you're considering the design, adoption, and implementation of any other types of policies or strategies which may have direct or indirect implications for wellbeing. Of course, quite often law schools are constrained by policies, strategies, and practices that come down from the wider institution or higher levels within the institution, and that can be difficult. But in that case, I think senior management in the law school have a really key role to play in how they mediate the implementation of those edicts. And that can be something that can be very difficult for senior management. And in the interviews we conducted with heads of law school, they found that a difficult but very important part of their jobs. Another aspect we mention here is around co-creation, and this is about staff and students working in partnership, for example, to create a wellbeing strategy. If you go to the Student Minds website, which is a charity for student mental health in the UK, they have a full guide on how to co-create a wellbeing policy, which can be really useful, and there are other sources out there. But the co-creation process itself has been shown to have significant benefits for well-being. It builds connection between staff and students. It enables for more clear and transparent communication. It enables a better understanding about what students and staff want and what they need. So having that form of co-creation in there can be vital, whether that's co-creating a wellbeing strategy or even co-creating, for example, a teaching session, or even I've heard a whole module being co-created in the past. And this really leads on to the next guideline, which is all about the importance of relationships. If you read the work of people such as Susan Brooks and Marjorie Silver, academics in the US, you will know that law schools are effectively all about relationality. They are a community. And therefore, it's important that the relationships, both between staff and students, among students and among staff, are supportive, collaborative, and respectful. We need to promote that culture of trust, belonging, and inclusivity. Belonging, that sense of belonging, has been shown to be one of the strongest predictors of levels of well-being. So it's vital to focus upon promoting that belonging. And part of that, is, of course, is because it removes that sense of isolation or exclusion that individuals may feel. And sometimes this can be really small steps. For example, it could just be looking at your entrance hall or reception area in your law school. What messages does it give to people who come in? One of the things we did in our law school was we put together what we termed a trail of legal heroism, with the idea of amplifying the voices of marginalised groups within law. So we highlighted a number of people through nominations from staff and students, and we ensured that their images and information about their work and their contributions were visible as soon as you came into the law school and throughout the law school. And actually in that process, it sparked many conversations, and it sparked a growing and increasing awareness about notions of belonging, which I think in itself was important. I've mentioned several times so far the idea that there are certain norms or expectations within law as a discipline that have been identified as detrimental to well-being. You may well be able to identify ones within your jurisdiction that I am simply not aware of, because I know that the literature on this is quite heavily focused upon specific jurisdictions such as Australia. Some of those that I've mentioned in passing already are things like that adversarialism, competitiveness, and there have been studies that demonstrate that this can lead to a lack of social connectedness and a sense of individualism, which can make things like teamwork particularly difficult for law students. That idea that we construe being a lawyer very narrowly. We do thinking like a lawyer. Do we ever look at feeling like a lawyer? The idea that sometimes in a heavily text-based discipline, there can be a stifling of creativity. We may not always be able to give our students the choices and freedom to decide they want. There is not always a focus on social and emotional literacy. We don't always talk about values. How often do we explore the values underlying aspects of our justice system? How often do we encourage students to explore their own personal values and their motivations for doing a law degree and perhaps going on to the legal profession? Unfortunately, there is evidence that well-being is stigmatized, particularly within the legal profession. Certainly through my own work with lawyers in the UK, a common message was we need to appear to be strong. We can't show any signs of mental ill health or poor well-being because it would be construed as weakness. It would damage our reputation, it would damage our career. Obviously, well-being and mental ill health are not signs of weakness, but the fact they are construed like that leads to high levels of perceived stigma. And I think there is certainly signs that law students absorb these type of messages at a very early stage. And that is something we need to consciously and explicitly counteract. We're of course doing this in an environment, particularly maybe an economic environment, where there are increasing workload and time pressures on staff, which can make this challenging, but also on students. For example, the rising numbers of students who have to work to be able to afford to continue studying. I've already mentioned the importance to some extent of acknowledging and seeking to address intersections between wellbeing and issues of equality, diversity and inclusion. This is really a significant part of working on the idea of belonging within law schools. Again, this stems partly, at least, from the International Bar Association's study on lawyers, where it was demonstrated that those with the lowest levels of well-being were people who identified as female in gender, people who identified as having a disability, and those from marginalised ethnic groupings. So we can see that there are those intersections, and it's important to acknowledge that well-being and equality, diversity and inclusion cannot be separated. The final point is that law schools have to seek to have an ongoing dialogue, and that must be internal but also external. It is about not reinventing the wheel. That's why one of the reasons, at least, I'm so pleased to be talking about this here with you today, because it's important we talk within jurisdictions, across disciplines, basically to keep evolving our idea of what thriving and well-being are, and thinking about and taking inspiration from the work done in other disciplines, in other areas, in other institutions, so we can keep developing this work, we can keep on the journey around well-being. So I just wanted to end with some final reflections, then I'd love to hear any thoughts and questions that you might have. The first thing, and I'm sure this has come across already, is that there are no easy answers. Well-being and thriving are not just about us as individuals. They're not just even about our law school environment. They are heavily related to wider socio-economic, cultural, and other societal factors that we have to navigate. And often we're looking for different compromises and trying to strike balances. It's very rare we're going to reach an ideal solution. However, I don't want to sound too negative, because I do believe that there are steps which can be taken by institutions such as universities, by law schools, and by the individuals within law schools to improve staff and student well-being. And that is really what the guidelines focus on. There are things we can do that can, evidence shows, be effective. Again, these often involve difficult balancing acts around resources, around motivation, around getting enough people involved and engaged in what you're doing for it actually to be sustainable, and about looking at the needs of differing stakeholders, whether that's students, whether that's staff, whether that's legal professionals, whoever it may be. However, you know, if nobody is alone in doing that, there are international communities, there are international resources that can help in navigating these difficult and challenging balancing acts. And I think I would want to end on the message that it is worth navigating those balancing acts. It is worth putting in that time and that work and that effort, because thriving, not just surviving, is absolutely crucial in our contemporary law schools. So thank you very much for listening to me. I know Michael kindly said that after the session he would circulate a copy of the IBA guidelines, and if you'd like to talk about that more, or you're interested in joining our international community of practice around the guidelines, please don't hesitate to connect with me. But in the meantime, I'd really love to hear your reflections and questions.
Many thanks, Emma, for that. That's great. And just to remind people that if there are any more questions, could you send them to me in the chat box, to me, Michael Lower. Emma, just to start off with a question. So you talked about the importance of evaluating well-being measures, or measures to promote well-being. Guideline 5. How can you measure? What kind of measurement tools might there be? What would you measure that would avoid tick box approach?
So that's a really good question. And actually, it can be quite tricky to measure well-being, because some indications that seem quite negative can be positive. So, for example, when I was Director of Student Wellbeing, one of the things we looked at was the number of students who referred themselves to our institute's student wellbeing service. And that actually rose significantly during the time we developed our wellbeing work. So you may think, well, that is quite a negative thing, more and more students needing additional wellbeing support. But we actually saw it as a huge positive that students now had the literacy to understand that they needed support, and were actually accessing that support. They had that awareness. So it can be very tricky. I think you can do it on lots of different levels. I think the first level is just about those conversations. Particularly if you're a member of staff, you're likely to be having regular discussions with students. You're likely to get a feel for how levels of well-being are generally amongst the student population and probably amongst your colleagues as well. And that in itself is really valuable information. If your institution or your law school run general surveys, so for example, in our law school, we have kind of evaluations for every module that's run, you're likely to pick up relevant information amongst that, which I think is sometimes overlooked because obviously people are very concerned to look at specific elements of modules, but often there are indications in that around well-being. Similarly, at our university, we're in the National Student Survey, things like that. And again, if you read the data with an eye to the well-being implications, then again, you can draw out interesting data from that. If you want to approach it from more of a research kind of standpoint, there are particular measures you can use. There are plenty of measures you can use to assess well-being. Some of those are quite general ones and quite straightforward. So the World Health Organization has the WHO-5 measure of well-being. It's 5 simple questions about how people have felt over the last 2 weeks. And that was something we applied in the IBA Global Survey of Lawyers. It's been applied in quite a lot of work. There are also specific larger and longer scales, standardized measures. So there was a recent piece of work in the UK by researchers at King's College London, and they actually looked at the different wellbeing scales to see what are the best scales to use to measure student wellbeing in particular. And they recommended a couple for that. For example, the GP Core scale, which is free to use under a kind of non-commercial license. So there are those standardized measures if you want to do a sort of deeper dive into the psychological aspects as well. But for people who may not have the time, the resources to do that, simply having those conversations and utilizing the data that your law school will already have can be really valuable.
Thanks, Emma. Just one thing. So part of what you said is about kind of raising kind of sensitivity or literacy around well-being. And then it occurred to me that, you're talking about this community of practice that you set up. I mean, I don't know whether you want to talk about it, because I guess part of that is about the members of that community kind of sharpening antennae around well-being.
Yes, and I think I mentioned briefly, it's been very interesting that we have law schools from all over the world, and it's very clear that in some countries, the idea of well-being, certainly in law schools, isn't really discussed. Also, the idea of the word well-being is perhaps not recognized in the same way. So, for some people, it might be easier to use words like thriving or flourishing or empowering, or there may well be lots of different vocabulary that effectively means similar things to well-being, but it is more easily understood in that particular cultural context. And we acknowledge in the guidelines that might be well-being is just the word we've used because it's almost ubiquitous in Western society, but that may well not be the case in other jurisdictions. One thing we did when we set up the community of practice is we have individuals who are leading the work in their law schools, but we ask those individuals to get the support of their law schools, because one thing that concerns me is quite often you have the position where you have one or a small group of very motivated individuals who want to do this work and who are passionate about staff and student well-being, but then the entire kind of load in terms of workload, emotional load and everything falls on those individuals, and everybody else kind of thinks, well, that's not our role because X does this in our law school. So we really wanted to get that wider support from the law school as a whole, because while there might be those passionate individuals, it's always got to be about what you would term a whole law school approach. It can't just be one person's responsibility.
Well, a couple of kind of side things that tie into that. So like, integrating well-being with the mission of the law school and the whole law school. So I was wondering, whether you see an intersection between kind of the well-being agenda and kind of the teaching and learning agenda, and like improving the design, delivery of teaching, learning, assessment, feedback, whether you see them being linked?
Yes, I think they are incredibly interlinked, and I think that it's increasingly becoming recognised that one of the best ways to promote well-being literacy and often to promote positive well-being is to incorporate well-being into learning and teaching, because that is the core business of law schools. It's the core business of universities. So it makes sense to integrate that. And it doesn't have to be in complicated ways. It can be as simple as, a slide at the beginning of a session that introduces yourself as the lecturer, that tells people a little bit about you as a person, to give them that sense of connection and belonging. It can be about helping students with healthy study habits. So, trying to discourage them from, studying till 5 a.m, drinking energy drinks. It can be about talking more about well-being and pulling out well-being issues within the actual substantive content of modules. Because if you can do it for law of obligations, I'm pretty sure you can do it for any legal topic. And as I said, it can also be about those practical things. What is the physical environment a student is having their teaching events in? Is that one that's likely to promote well-being? Because well-being, of course, I've focused quite a lot on kind of psychological well-being, but of course there's also physical well-being, there's financial well-being, there's all these different aspects of well-being. So taking account of those is really important as well.
So I also, like our next talk on the 2nd of October, we're going to see in a second, is going to be Francine Ryan. She's going to be talking about graduate attributes, which perhaps another way of saying graduate attributes might be like character in a way, but character from the perspective of, well, will it know my character help me to get and keep a job? And again, I just wonder whether you see whether you see an interlinking between, the kind of, so graduate attributes, that sense of purpose, where I'm going to next, and whether that links in with the well-being agenda.
Yeah, I definitely think it does. And I suppose to some extent it ties in with what do we see as the purpose of a law degree. And for me, an important purpose is to develop students as citizens. And I think that again goes back to that idea of students having meaning and purpose, having had the opportunity to explore their own values, to understand, the values of the society they're going to live and work within, and having those explicit conversations about that. And I think that fits in incredibly well with the eudaimonic tradition of well-being in particular. I also think that certainly in the UK, there is an increasing focus on graduate attributes that do link closely to well-being. So, for example, at my university, the graduate attributes specifically talk about well-being. They specifically talk about emotional literacy. And I think that's a really positive thing, because in the working environment that most students will go into, it's increasingly being acknowledged that those are important aspects. Thinking about students who may well go on to the legal profession, we need to equip them with an understanding of how they will navigate that environment, which is a very challenging environment to work in healthy ways. We need them to have the attributes to be able to do that. And also, it correlates with ethical things as well. There is some evidence that by people such as Stephen Tang, that where your well-being is poor as a lawyer, you are going to have more difficulty in making good ethical decisions. Your judgment is going to be impaired. So actually, again, it ties in with, we want our graduates to be ethical, and to do that, we need to encourage them to understand their values, to be aware of ethics, and it all again relates to well-being.
Mm-hmm. Got a question from Lee Shane, in the audience, who asks, do you think that collaborative approaches in teaching can cause negative effects on students' well-being? And if so, how could we prevent it? So
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. So I'm going to guess by collaborative approaches, you're thinking of students undertaking group work, possibly. And I think there is some evidence that students find group work quite hard, and it can be quite challenging to their well-being, particularly when there are difficult group dynamics. Or, for example, say someone has social anxiety and they find it very difficult in that situation. And there's always got to, I think, be a background of reasonable adjustments being offered. But at the same time, I think that group work can be incredibly positive for well-being, but it is about putting in the scaffolding, really taking the time to build the group work in positive ways. Personally, I teach a module called digital lawyering with my students, where the students work in small groups throughout the module to undertake a law tech project. And so I see that the group dynamics can be difficult, but I've put hours into scaffolding each session. So at the first session, where they are in the groups, actually about over half of it is led by me. And it's really building up that kind of connection and bonding in the teams. But then by the final session, other than a quick reflection at the start and end, the groups are entirely independent. So I think a lot of it is about that pedagogy in terms of building group work, because it can't assume. It's good to challenge these ideas of individualism and adversarialism and competitiveness that we know are associated with law students, but we can't assume it's going to be positive. We have to really put the work in, I think.
That's great. And I think we've probably kind of hit the limit. So many thanks for that.
Thank you.